Shabbat Shalom. So, in my opinion, one of the things that makes the Tanakh great literature is the fact that its characters are multidimensional. They're presented warts and all, right? I mean, if somebody is portrayed as perfect, it's easy to say, they can't be my role model because there's no way that I can be perfect, right? But the characters in the Tanakh, for the most part, are flawed human beings who strive to do good despite their flaws. And that's what all of us are, right? At least if we're all flawed human beings, but we should strive to do good nevertheless. And one of the things that you have heard me criticize at times is how the rabbinic tradition kind of flattens that and takes people who are portrayed multidimensionally in the Torah and makes them paper mache saints, let's say. And we see this with the treatment of Joseph, I think, who is referred to in the rabbinic tradition as Yosef HaTzadik, Joseph the righteous, right? But if you look, I mean, we didn't read this morning, but at the beginning of the Parashat, I have to say that his conduct is not particularly admirable, right? I mean, he's a braggart at best, and it also says that he brought his brother's evil report to their father, right? He's not only a braggart, he's also a tattletale, right? And anybody who's been to kindergarten or first grade, right, knows that we don't like tattletales, right? And rightly so. I mean, there may be an exaggerated, but rightly so. So the Hasidic commentator, Rabbi Menachem of Amshinov, says, wait a second, right? It says in the Torah that Joseph brought his brother's evil report to their father. Okay, but how can this be? Because Joseph is a tzaddik, he's a totally righteous person, right? So can it be that Joseph was like a tattletale? And Rabbi Menachem says, no, it's just that Joseph excelled above his brothers, and Jacob rebuked the other brothers for not being more like Joseph, right? Why aren't you more like Joseph, your brother, who's so good, right? And so he was like the cause of their being rebuked. Okay, so if that's the case, why did God allow him to be punished? And Rabbi Menachem says, because a righteous person should hide his good deeds even from his father. In other words, it can be a sin to be too visibly righteous because it puts others in a bad light by comparison, right? And, I try to avoid you seeing how righteous I actually am, right? So like, I fast all the time, but in order so that you don't know I'm fasting, I eat, so you could see me eating, and that way you don't know I'm fasting, right? But that's what, I mean, obviously that's a joke, but the point is, don't be too visibly righteous, and it says that in Proverbs, be not righteous over much. Oh, be not righteous over much, because it makes others look bad in comparison. And Jewish tradition is actually very, very sensitive to the sinfulness of slander and humiliation, right? And there's stories of the Chafetz Chaim, who wrote a whole book on the laws of Lashon Hara, of evil speech. And there's a story that he was riding on a train and he fell asleep, and then he woke up and he hears his fellow passengers and they start to whisper. Okay, and so he says, well, what are you talking about? And they say, oh, we're embarrassed that we're talking about, horses and stuff like that. And Chafetz Chaim says, great, I'm so delighted that you're talking about horses, because it's much better to talk about horses than to talk about other people. Okay, and there's a story, and I don't know if it's true or not, but the Chafetz Chaim had poor hearing, and there was an operation that could improve his hearing, and he refused to have it because if he didn't hear well, then he wouldn't hear gospel. Right? And he wouldn't hear Lashon Hara. And so by improving his hearing, he refused to have this operation. Okay, and I don't know if the Chafetz Chaim was married at this point, but I wonder what Mrs. Chafetz Chaim would have said about that. But what do we care about what she, right? But so I spoke about the story of Judah and Tamar, right? And the key to this, as I said, is that she sent the sign, the signet ring and the staff secretly, right? Thus risking death, right? But Rabbi Jonathan Sachs writes about this incident, and he says, with great ingenuity and boldness, Tamar has broken through the bind in which Judah had placed her. She's fulfilled her duty to the dead, but by having, by getting pregnant, but no less significantly, she spared Judah shame, right? Because she sent this coded message, so he knows that he's the father of the child, but no one else will unless Judah chooses to acknowledge this, and she's taken an enormous risk of being put to death for adultery. And Rabbi Sachs says that it is from this incident that the Talmud in Baba Metzia has deduced a strong moral rule. It is better that a person throw himself into a fiery furnace than to shame another person in public. Okay, and the sages were very, very sensitive to this, right? Whoever shames another person in public, it is as if he shed his blood. If you publicly humiliate another person, you forfeit your place in the world to come, and so on and so forth, right? And Judaism is a religion of words, right? And I mean, all right, so we've eliminated the preliminary service, but how does it begin? Baruch she'amar v'haya ha'olam. Blessed is the one who spoke, and the world came to be, right? God created the world with word, right? Let there be light, let there be dry land, let there be oceans, etc. Right? And we create and sometimes destroy our social world with words, right? And we have such a strong ethic of speech, both to preserve our social world, but also to protect human dignity, right? Psychological injury is no less harmful than physical injury, right? And I have to say, I'm learning that this week. I mean, not that, I mean, obviously the guy who hit me didn't intend to do so, right? And he took responsibility, which is like 50%, because you know, his insurance company has acknowledged liability, and now it's just a question of figuring out what that liability is. And I have to say that the physical bruises are less than the psychological suffering I'm going through and will probably continue to go through for a while, right? And both of those are compensable, right? But psychological damage is real damage, right? And the American legal tradition understands that as well, right? And that's why you can sue for damages, even if you were physically unharmed, right? We have laws against slander, etc., etc., right? And we should never humiliate, never put people in a situation of harming their dignity, right? And you can't, well, it was just words. It was just words. Well, right, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never harm me is absolutely not a Jewish saying. Words can definitely harm, right? And I was interested to read something that Rabbi Sachs wrote about an episode in the mid-1970s when he was in yeshiva, okay? And the context of time is very important, the mid-1970s, because he says that he and some of his fellow yeshiva students were at a conference, and there were students from different yeshivas and also different rabbinical seminaries, and they were at a conference in Switzerland, and they were at Shacharit morning service, and into a few minutes after the service has started, a woman entered the room wearing talis and tefillin and sat down among the men, right? And she was a rabbinical student, a reform rabbinical student, and the men didn't know what to do, right? And I have to point out that in the 70s, a woman wearing talis and tefillin would have been extremely unusual. I mean, I remember when I was in rabbinical school and my brother came to visit me for a weekend, and you know, my brother was not that into Judaism, as you know, right? And today he's a Unitarian, but he was visiting me, and he was in college at the time, and I sort of forced him to come to Shabbat morning services with me. And walked in a female classmate, was, rabbinical seminary after all, walked in wearing a talit. It was Saturday morning, so she wasn't wearing tefillin, but she's wearing a talit. And my brother looks, and he grabs my arm, and he says to me, "There's a woman wearing a tallis. Even I know that's wrong." Right. So, so they didn't know what to do, right? So they go to the rabbi who's leading the group, who's a highly respected Rosh Yeshiva in Israel, and he quoted this verse that I quoted before from Baba Messiah. It is better that a person throw himself into a fiery furnace than shame his neighbor in public. In other words, it would be a tremendous sin to shame that female rabbinical student who was wearing towels and tefillin, which from their perspective is something that she should not be doing, right? And they didn't have a women's section because it never occurred to them to have a women's section, right? So, and that's why, for example, like if somebody's leading services and they make a mistake, I don't correct them, right? I mean, you don't want to embarrass somebody in public, right? And there are rules also about when the gabbai should correct the Torah reader, right? And if the Torah reader makes a mistake, but it doesn't change the meaning, you're not supposed to correct them, right? Now, this presupposes that the gabbai knows Hebrew well enough to know whether this is an error that should be corrected or not, right? But if you go to some schools, and it's like a game, right? How much can we correct the Torah reader, right? And it's wrong. It may be fun, but it's wrong, right? Embarrassing people is not a sport, right? And, but this story that Rabbi Sachs wrote about is interesting to me because a colleague of mine who is a female conservative rabbi in Baltimore, and her father passed away, and she's making tremendous efforts to daven with a minyan 3 times a day to say Kaddish, right? And if she's, traveling, she can't, so she'll do it online, but she really tries to get to an in-person minyan 3 times a day, which means that she's memorized, because there's a lot of Orthodox schools in Baltimore, and some of them are really what we would call minyan factories, right? Like they may have a minyan, they may have Ma'ariv every 15 minutes from 7 p.m. to 10 p.m., right? And there's constantly, and so she is davening fairly frequently in Orthodox schools, and she writes about her experience, and it's great to see that she's not run into situation, oh, what are you doing here, right, or whatever. Now, of course, she understands that if she's going into an Orthodox space, she's going to be in the women's section, and she's not going to be counted in the minyan, and she understands that, and she doesn't challenge that. Obviously, it's not that way in her own shul, but, it gives her the opportunity to say Kaddish no matter where she, and I enjoy really reading about it, and it's nice that that experience exists, right? And You know, I have to say, I mean, I spoke about this on Rosh Hashanah, but, you know, I was interested to read the summary, of the focus groups that Charlotte, put together. And there, towards the end, there was one line, I don't remember exactly how it was worded, but one congregant said that, you know, unless we start do you remember exactly how you phrased it?
I forgot what it was, but, if we don't start making more of an effort to get along with everybody else, we will not survive.
Right, okay, and it's the same thing that I spoke about, right, on Rosh Hashanah, right? We have to learn to respect each other and treat each other compassionately. And there is nothing wrong with disagreeing, right? I mean, if you care intensely about something, then disagreement is natural, but disagreement should never slide into disrespect or lack of compassion or embarrassing another person in public, right? And that's why, you know, as an employee of Jewish nonprofits, right, which I've been for 30 some odd years, right? My first rule is no surprises, right? I certainly don't want to bring up something at a board meeting that the officers are gonna be caught off guard, right? And I also don't want them to bring up something at a board meeting that I'm gonna be caught off guard, right? And I'm delighted, and I'm not just saying that because Lori is here, but we have that kind of relationship, right there. I don't know that we've ever articulated the no surprises rule, but we act that way, right? I make sure Lori knows what's going on. Lori makes sure I know what's going on. And that way, the embarrassment of being surprised at a board meeting is avoided, right? That the idea, we have to, I'm not saying, right, throw yourself into a burning, fiery furnace, right? But before you, right, instead of like speaking twice and thinking once, think twice and speak once, and the world will be a better place. Shabbat shalom. And continue with Musaf, say the Kaddish before Musaf, page 155 or 428, and then the first two